Welcome back, everybody. So we're continuing with the afternoon session now, and the professor will tell us about the second greatest story ever told. So over to Professor.
Thank you. Before I go on with the new subject, I'd like to go back to the end of the previous session. There's a little reading assignment I'm going to give you. This is from Hayek. The caption is The Extended Order of Information, page 8, towards the end. I want you to read it on your own, and if you have questions, feel free to bring them up. Not today, anytime during the course. So I won't return to that, but I think it's interesting, it's a good idea, and I try to encourage you to go back to the original Hayek and read it there, from the horse's mouth. Okay, now, the second greatest story ever told. Why second? Well, of course, you know what the first greatest story, or the greatest story ever told is. It's the Bible, and there was a movie made out of it many years ago, very successful. So I'm thinking of finding a producer who will produce another movie with the title The Second Greatest Story Ever Told. We have some candidates present, and we'll see how successful they are, because after the break there's a little surprise, and I don't tell you more now, but just wait and see. So the second greatest story is the story of the real bill, in particular how the real bill started circulating. And this is important because according to the fable, which is current in economic circles, universities, but also very much so within the sound money movement, I would say the majority of sound money advocates just take this fable at face value. The fable says that paper currency was born on the day when the goldsmith decided to become a fraudulent warehouseman. Because, especially in the early Renaissance, late Middle Ages, people who had gold, they thought that they are not secure to keep that gold on their premises, so they would go to the goldsmith and say, well, would you take my gold and keep it for me, safekeeping? And the goldsmith agreed and gave a receipt, a piece of paper stating that so much gold is on deposit. And the owner of the gold, very much to his surprise, found that he could actually make payments with this, because the name of the goldsmith was very well known, and people thought that this was a good idea because then the gold was still there, and they made payments, so the new holder of the bill could recover the gold anytime he wanted. In other words, this was a warehouse certificate originally made out in the name of the owner. But then they changed the practice and they said, okay, it's bearer. Whoever has that paper owns the gold on deposit with the goldsmith. So that worked, and still a fable, remind you, but so far so good. The trouble started when the goldsmith realized what was going on, that his paper was accepted accepted at face value and circulated money. So he thought, well, that's good business. Why not issue certificate on non-existing gold and put it in circulation? That's wonderful business. So he did that, and it worked. And the funny thing, according to this fable, was that nobody complained. They were happy, and the more paper the fraudulent goldsmith put into circulation, I guess it's an early Madoff, what we are talking about, you see. The more paper he put into circulation, the happier everybody was, because there's no shortage of purchasing medium. Now, I am not denying that this could have happened. Sure, it could have happened. What I am questioning is that this is the valid explanation. And I question this because I don't want to insult the intelligence of my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and other people who have fallen such an easy victim to such a crude swindle. I mean, the first, how is the saying? Cheat me once, shame on me, you. Cheat me twice,
Shame on me.
Shame on me. So, first it succeeded, but sooner or later, just like in the case of Madoff, the truth came out. And it's incredible to me, to my mind, that they could just repeat and repeat and repeat the same old crude swindle, and even after it becomes publicly known that this is going on, the people will still fall for it. So that doesn't sound right to me. And what is more, I find a better explanation how paper money came into being. And that's exactly the second greatest story ever told. So I don't know how you feel about it, but this constant harping on fractional reserve banking. Now, I'm not denying that there is no fraud involved here and there and there, but to dismiss the whole industry of commercial banking as fraudulent because they create credit out of thin air and put it in circulation, people who have the right to refuse it, they don't, they just happily embrace it, is too much for me to take on faith. So we'll discuss fractional reserve banking also separately, but here you see the suggestion is this fable, what I just explained, suggests that fractional reserve banking was or originated from this fraudulent practice of the goldsmith who issued gold deposit, gold warehouse certificates on non-existent gold. Now, I'm not saying it never ever happened, but I'm saying that it was not the origin of the paper money system, because of various reasons which we are going to see in greater detail. So, what is the true explanation? The true explanation is that the paper money originated from real bill circulation. According to some authors, real bills existed since time immemorial. In fact, originally it looked more like a letter of credit. somebody who was traveling, say, from Rome to Athens, and there was a lively trade relationship between the two cities, say, at the time of birth of Christ or something like that, 2,000 years ago. And this person was traveling from Rome to Athens, planned for a longer stay, and he needed resources to survive, to live in a strange city. And he thought it was unsafe to carry this in the form of gold or silver. There were sea voyages involved, and there was piracy in the Mediterranean, and so he was thinking of some better ways. And taking advantage of this trade, this person was smart enough to think that there were merchants in Rome and merchants in Athens who dispatched goods, and he assumed that the payment in the form of gold and silver was not going in opposite directions. It just didn't make sense. So he assumed that only the difference was transferred in the form of gold and silver. In other words, there was credit, commercial credit. And therefore he assumed that there must be merchants in Athens who owe payment to his correspondent merchant in Rome. So he looked around, asked around, and found that indeed there was a merchant in Rome who had shipped the goods which hasn't yet been paid. So he asked him, well, can I buy that receivable from you in Athens? And there's no shipment needed because I pay you right here in Rome, and you give me a letter of credit, and if the pirates take it from me, they won't have any use for it because it's a personal letter. So when I arrive in Athens, I will go to your correspondent and present it, and he will give me money. And then we save a lot of trouble that way. And of course, the merchant in Rome agreed, and that was done, and this was an embryonic form of the bill of exchange, you see. And in fact, we have a document testifying to this, no lesser of an author than Cicero. His correspondence with another guy called Atticus survived, and in this letter, Cicero asking Atticus if his son, who was going to Athens to study, would be all right if he takes a letter of credit, and we don't have the answer of Atticus, but the question was asked, and we can assume that if Atticus had any intelligence, he must have agreed that this was indeed a good idea, and then they found the way to put this into effect. So we know that much, but we don't have to believe that this was done very widely, because there is no surviving evidence. There are no surviving bills or letters of credit which would prove it beyond doubt. So we might just start our little story in the 14th century. Italian cities, port cities mainly, Florence, Genoa, now Venice, Venice is a port city, and Genoa is a port city. Florence isn't, but it does have the port which belonged to the Florentine Republic. What's the name of the?
Pisa.
Pisa. So, so actually that's what made Florence great, because it had easy access to sea travel because of the proximity of. All right, so in these, at least in these three cities, but perhaps in others as well, very much about the same time, they invented the bill of exchange, which eventually became a circulating medium. And this was a very, very great invention indeed. And it's comparable to the inventing of the wheel. Or nobody knows historically when the wheel was invented, of course. But later on they invented money as we know it, because originally it was not money, but it was barter. And then the market process promoted one commodity which people accepted even if they had no need, personal need for that, because they knew that this had the highest marketability. So if they needed to buy something, it was much easier for them to offer this unneeded or not needed commodity when they wanted to purchase something. What they had to sell had no real marketability, so they had to find a party which just needed this. But it was very unlikely that this other party had the good which I needed, so therefore the trade couldn't take place. Until they discovered that if they hit on the most marketable good, then they just exchange it for the most marketable good, and that could be bartered away for what you needed. And as we all know, the most marketable good was gold or silver. We'll go into, or it's another subject of another course, but let's just leave it at that. The most marketable good became most marketable because it had the best marginal utility. Now, all commodities are subject to the law of declining marginal utility. The more you have, the less you need an extra portion. And the most marketable good, let's assume it also has declining marginal utility. However, that marginal utility declines less than the marginal utility of any other good. Well, obviously there must be some such good, and we don't care what it is. We know it became gold, could have become something else, but this is a fact that there is one most marketable good. So this is the origin of money as Menger explains, and nobody could improve on that theory. So what we are talking about here is something similar, but not exactly the same. It's the question how the bill of exchange came into existence. So as I say, we know much more about it than what Menger was speculating about, and the invention of the wheel we know very little because it's too far back in history. But these examples of Florence, Venice, and Genoa are close enough to us in time that actually where there are examples of these early bills, which are preserved, and you can look up in the museums or libraries and study them, and they have been studied very thoroughly. So there's all the evidence there that how they first appeared, and then a couple decades later they improved, they were more careful to spell things out, such as what is the exact cargo in that boat which is coming from from somewhere, Far East maybe, and all this document is on record. So there is really no question about this. And the only problem is to explain how ultimately these early commercial paper examples, bills of exchange, real bills, became so marketable that without any questioning people accepted them in payment, and they started circulating. Well, money they were, but ephemeral money, because they all had a date of maturity. And it stands to reason, and you can check it on the record, that the usual maturity was at most 91 days. And we already mentioned this is due to the fact that the seasons of the year last a quarter of the year, 91 days. After 91 days, the type of merchandise in the greatest demand is going to change. So if you could not sell your merchandise within 91 days, then probably you won't be able to sell it for 365 days. Because you have to wait until the same season of the year comes around. But by that time, the taste of people could have changed. There could have been improvements in the production facilities which made the good cheaper. And there was enormous risk, but was no risk if you can sell it, if you know that you can sell it in 91 days. The risk of being able to sell it 365 days later grew enormously, and it was just a risk which ordinary merchants could not carry. So this is the importance of the date, that these short-term credit instruments, the real bills, matured in no more than 91 days. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. So we owe it to the Italian inventive spirit. Remember, Italy at that time was not a unified state. These were cities, self-governing cities, Florence, Venice, Genoa, and maybe others as well. And but they hit upon the same idea. Thanks to the Mediterranean, it's a warm sea, it's navigable. They know icebergs in the Mediterranean, of course, and already the Greeks discovered the tremendous potential of sea trade through sea voyages, even before the sail was invented. They had these boats, also military, but we are talking about the commercial boats which the slaves powered with their paddles, sometimes 30 on one side and 30 on the other, and then there was a slave driver who gave the beat, and they just had to do it on the beat. And of course that improved, sail came into use and so on. So this is what happened. And as I say, the remarkable thing was that simultaneously in at least 3 cities they hit upon the same idea. And it worked, and it was a very, very great success. So I go to the end of this chapter and talk about the merchants of Seville. You might say, wow, there's something wrong, it's a merchant of Venice. No, this is the merchants, in plural, of Seville. Why? Because Seville was a great fair city. By fair city I mean a city where regular annual fairs were held. So we are talking about a landlocked country where you can travel in almost any direction, hundreds of miles. So Italy would not be a suitable example for that, because I am assuming that this is land transportation. If a city had the brilliant idea of organizing annual fairs, they could invite participants from as far as 500 miles away, which in those days was a tremendous distance, because these were horse-driven carts, and for example, if you were a shoemaker or a bootmaker, then you would load as many pairs of boots on your cart as you could, and have your horses or team of horses and set out to Seville, because there is the great city, the great fair, annual fair, and it would last a whole month. So you can sell out your production in a month's time. And then you have need for other things which you can buy, and you won't come back with an empty cart, because you buy the merchandise you need, either in your production or for consumption or whatever. But this was a very efficient way of trading. You had the merchandise you wanted to sell, and on the way back you had the merchandise what you needed. And there's only one problem. You see, and a big problem indeed it was. What was the problem? I mean, the idea is brilliant, but there is a but. What is the but? The but is that you have to sell before you can buy, right? I mean, it's, in theory, it's perfect that you have the boots to sell and you want to buy. But if you cannot sell the boots early enough, and your last pair is sold on the last day of the fair, it's too bad, because by that time the cream of the crop is gone. You see, if you wanted to buy, you want to be an early bird, because it's a finite fair. And those who had money, they bought early, they got a good deal, but if you waited, then you had just a leftover, maybe second grade or third grade, which the quality was no good, and certainly the selection was much narrower. And that is a very, very great problem. If you ever traded, you would have this experience that you arrived late to the party, to only the leftovers. It didn't appeal to you. So how could you solve that problem? Well, you could solve the problem to take a lot of gold with you together with the boots. But that was not a very good idea. Number one, you could be robbed. Number two, you would have to have the cash gold, and you may not, because gold was scarce, and you would have to borrow it, and that involved other costs. So you had to find a better idea than that. And they indeed found this better idea. What was the better idea? And that is what I assume the city fathers of Seville were ingenious, because they thought of that. Together with the fair, they set up a clearing house. So when these carts with merchandise from different directions arrived, they registered their merchandise with the clearing house. They showed them, this is what we have, and so much we had, and such quality we have. And then the clearing house gave them chits, which were pieces of paper. Don't call them bill of exchange, but very similar. The idea was that during that month, these you could spend. Well, that was credit, really, wasn't it? Because even if you couldn't sell out your merchandise the first day, you could still buy the first day of the fair. You see, because you had the chit. And so you were not handicapped by the fact that your merchandise was selling out, but rather slowly. Originally it was a great handicap, but then this was eliminated by this chit system. So then there was very little gold needed to maintain this fair, because at the end of the fair you had to present your chits to the clearing house. And then only the difference had to be paid in gold. If you sold less than you bought, then okay, you could you could pay the bulk of your purchase with chits, but there was a difference that you had to pay in gold. And that was reasonable, because that was the smaller, by far the smaller part of what you owed to the clearing house. And then conversely, there were some people who sold more than they bought, and they had to be paid. And that was the clearing house's job, to make sure that if you had extra chits, they will pay you in gold. So that was the clearing system invented. I'm pretending that it was invented in Seville, but Seville was just one of the great fair cities. There was one in France also, maybe have been more. I think Lyon was the French. In Germany there's Leipzig, which still exists today, the famous fair.
Fair.
Leipzig Fair.
Leipzig Fair.
Oh, Leipzig Fair, yes. And there might have been others, and I haven't done the research, and I'm not really interested. I'm not an historian, but I think it's a fascinating topic for an historian to actually show where the original idea came from and how it spread, and ultimately Europe was spotted with these fair cities, and sometimes there was division of labor. The city fathers in Seville agreed with the city fathers in Lyon that you do it in the spring, we'll do it in the fall. So there was always a possibility to take your merchandise to a fair city, and this was a very, very great improvement in the trading system. Remember, we are talking about the Renaissance. So at that time, trade was much smaller than it is, but this fair system gave a boost, and this was for the good of the whole society, because more merchandise available at a cheaper cost and much greater variety, quality, and so on. So the merchants of Seville, and this is a wonderful thing. I just like that example because it shows that credit can originate in consumption. There is no, if you think of it, there's no lending and borrowing involved. Absolutely none. It's just the fact that the merchandise you take to Seville has a high marketability. In other words, there is a high enough demand for it. So then the credit can be issued by the clearing house in advance, and then you can spend even before you sold. So this natural sequence, first sell, then buy, could be overruled. Wonderful. Who thought that this is possible? I mean, since time immemorial, you always had to sell first if you wanted to buy. And now all of a sudden, you can reverse and take advantage of the early bird privilege that you have a choice merchandise. You are the first one. You buy on the first day. Because you registered your merchandise, the clearinghouse got the chits, you can go ahead and buy. Time to sell. A fantastic invention. Comparable to the invention of the wheel. I keep saying, but if you really think it over, you will agree with me that after thousands and thousands of years of trading experience, whoever invented this fair system did a very great benefit to humanity, because without this we wouldn't have had the Renaissance giants of arts, painters, sculptors, architects, and then the literary achievements of the Renaissance. It was all made possible by the merchants who created the wealth. And they did not do it by working at a desk or at a bench, but they did it by trading, carrying the surplus merchandise from one place where there was a shortage of that, and vice versa. So this is what made wealth possible, not just commercial wealth, but also literary, artistic wealth, and scientific too. I mean, we know the tremendous inventions during the Renaissance, such as the telescope and the pendulum and all kinds of other things, which contributed a great deal to the advancement of our civilization. At the very root of it, you find trade. More trade, better quality, better organized, better financed, and the credit which is based on consumption. In spite of whoever else says, the fact is that there is such a thing as credit arising out of consumption. You see? You don't have to say, it's the same idea. You have to sell first in order to buy. But that can be the same here. It's not necessary to save if you want credit, because there is such a thing as credit arising out of consumption. And how does it arise? Through real bills and through chits at the great city fairs. You see? That's very, very important. I introduced that term, which might be useful to compare the two types of credits arising out of consumption. One is the bill of exchange. I call it vertical. credit. And the credit used in the city fairs, such as Seville, I call horizontal. I find it convenient to make that distinction because vertical means that there is this production process, the food chain, you see, the maturing merchandise, semi-finished good is handed from one producer to the next, to the next, to the next. So that is vertical because the product, to begin with, is pretty far from the consumer. And then it gets closer, 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 closer. So I think of this as being a vertical movement. And in fact, this is what another great Austrian economist, a student of Menger, did. His name is Böhm-Bawerk, double name, Eugene Böhm-Bawerk, who did not make the same mistake, by the way, what Mises did. In fact, they were arguing on this, that beside time preference, there is productivity. And Böhm-Bawerk he wrote a big treatise, a big book, several volumes, on capital and the rate of interest. And he was consistent in mentioning the productivity theory. He did not give it up. And Mises criticized him for that. He said, no. Rate of interest is a purely time preference phenomenon. The fact that every individual values present goods more highly than future goods. It's not just because there is plenty of slip between cup and lip, not just that, but he says, it's also because this is a philosophical concept, very much like time, space, and so on. So it is the structure. I'm not going to review that philosophical discussion, but I think Böhm-Bawerk was closer to the truth. But I'm mentioning his name here for a different reason, because he was the first one who introduced the concept of, how did he call it? Order of goods. He's talking about semi-finished goods, and he attached a number to every one of them, which number really represented the distance between the good and the ultimate consumer. So the merchandise in the hands of the retail merchandise is first order good, because it's ready to be sold and consumed. But then there are ingredients which go into the production of first order goods, which are not ready for consumption per se. You've got to do some more work on it before it does. So these are called second order goods, the ingredients of the first order goods. And then the question arises again, well, how are they made up? Well, they are made up from other ingredients. And the input into the production of the second order goods is what you call third order. And then you go on, fourth order, fifth order. And of course, as the division of labor improves, gets more refined, there are more and more and more layers. So in other words, it could be that the production of boots sometime in the Middle Ages took, say, 4 layers. And 200 years later, it may have taken 40 layers, because there were all other layers which got specialized to the extent that they could be considered independent industries. Could be the producing leather or various chemicals which could make the leather smoother. You use your imagination to think of various possibilities how to refine. And boots is not the best example. Then think of watch manufacturing, you see, which was a very important industry in Switzerland, of course. And then eventually quartz mechanism came in, and these all tremendous developments in the mechanical watch industry are not completely lost, but the fact is that it became outdated. So, but you can be sure that this meant increasing the number of steps a great deal. Another thing is, there is a wonderful little piece of, what shall I call it? I guess it's popular economics. The title is I the Pencil. I the Pencil. So the pencil speaks to you and says, well, you want to know that I'm not as simple as I look? Because, and then he tells you that the wood comes from Africa, the graphite comes from Asia, and how very complicated indeed it is to produce pencil as we know it. It's not as simple as you look, it's just a core of graphite surrounded with some quality wood, but a very complicated thing indeed to produce a pencil, and it's very convincing. So we are talking about various order of goods, from first order, which is the readily marketable merchandise, consumer good, and then foreign. So this I call vertical. Now, that happens when, and that's financed through bills of exchange. These merchants at various levels hand over the semi-finished good, and we say it's maturing into the gold coin. The semi-fair example is very different, because we are assuming that all these goods at the fair, or most of it anyhow, are first order goods. And people from different regions who came to the fair make an exchange, basically consumer goods. This is strictly not true, because probably the bootmaker wants to buy some leather, which is a semi-finished good. But for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that mostly we are talking about ready, consumable merchandise. So it's an example of horizontal trading. Credit which circulates horizontally, but credit still arising out of consumption. So this I found useful. I don't know, perhaps you will also. This is not terribly important, but in my thinking process, it did play a role. And I'm going to close with the idea that real bills never cause inflation, in spite of my opponents. my detractors. I have been attacked, especially by people from the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, or people who are, well, I don't know why I blame people at the Mises Institute, perhaps some of them who criticize me rather viciously, really were not instigated by Mises Institute. But anyhow, be it as it may. They say, yes, real bills are a great source of inflation, because that's just like fractional reserve banking. They create credit out of thin air. And it doesn't originate in savings. All credit must originate in savings and must be lending and borrowing involved. Well, I am very uncompromising on that. That credit which arises out of consumption has nothing to do with savings, and there is no lending and borrowing involved. It may look like that, but it's only formally. It's a false impression you are getting. It's an optical illusion. When a merchandise, semi-finished merchandise, produced at, say, the 5th order level, and then it goes to the 4th order level, this is not a lending and borrowing arrangement. Now my opponents say, no, you are wrong. The 5th order guy who delivers this to the 4th order guy, he is lending. And this guy is not paying cash, so he's borrowing. And the discount is the interest which you pay on the lending. You see, this is what they say, and it sounds very convincing, and you may be tempted to accept their argument. But this is completely wrong, for the following reason. The 5th order guy is further away from the consumer. In fact, 5 times removed, whereas the 4th order guy is only 4 times removed. So, which one is closer to the gold coin, which will ultimately extinguish all these obligations? Of course, the 4th order guy. So he cannot be the borrower. If anything, he has a little bit of advantage, because he's closer to the gold coin than the other guy. So who is in the driver's seat? If anything, I would say the 4th order. But I'm not even saying that. I'm saying that the 5th and 4th order guy form a partnership. Without, just like a pair of scissors, there are 2 blades. And if you take away one blade, it's useless as a scissor. This is just useless. You've got to have both. So you need both the 5th order and the 4th order guy to be a workable partnership. And then you produce something which the consumer will buy and is happy to buy and is waiting for it, and it has the maximum marketability. So this is completely wrong to break it up into a lending and borrowing process. There is no lending. It is a partnership, and it will prosper only if they cooperate. And cooperate they indeed do. And the way they cooperate is that they pass on the bill of exchange, endorse it and pass it on, and use it as a payment. And that's the only way to understand. If you force your way into this, push the idea of lending and borrowing, you are on the wrong track. You will never understand this marvelous market process which through the vertical movement of the goods and the opposite movement of the bill of exchange makes possible. So that's my position, and we are going to spend the rest of the course to discuss the further details. But you see it now, the problem is these 2 points of view, and I am very, very uncompromising on that. You may still feel free to criticize me if you think that I'm wrong. I'm open to criticism. I'll do my best to explain it. But for the life of me, I cannot see that you can explain the process, the market process, maturing goods, ultimately reaching the stage of being marketable and very much in demand. There is a last bit here, which I just mentioned, and then we'll have a break. The world trade today. You see, this is, here the watershed year is 1914. Before that, we had real bills, and the world trade was financed through short-term credit, real bills. And there was an enormous improvement in world trade during the 19th century, all the way up until 1914. And of course, World War I was a great setback, but the trend was not picked up after World War II, and there was, you can check the statistics, I did many years ago, and it wasn't easy, but I came to the conclusion that the setback in the level of world trade, the last peace year was 1913, and after that there was a big reduction in the level. And then, of course, the Depression came, and you might say after World War II, it could start flying again. Well, it did, but it did not reach the level of 1913 until sometime in the late 1970s. And that's surprising. I mean, you might have thought that, well, there was a war, there was a depression, there was another war, and then peaceful years, relatively peaceful, and then the world trade would recover quickly. After all, there were newly invented things, and people became more prosperous, they could afford to spend more. But the fact is that it did not happen. And I couldn't find any other explanation but the absence of real goods, you see. So the world trade today is in very bad shape because we are in the danger of trade wars, competitive devaluation. One country is twisting the arm of another, US twisting China for revaluing the currency. China is reluctant to do that. And there are any number of other examples. And all countries are falling over themselves trying to make their paper currency cheaper because they think this is a trade advantage. And it's just the opposite. So we are seeing a tremendous loss of wealth, because this is self-destructive. Each country is working against its own interests. Well, I think I stop here and be prepared for a little surprise after the break. But if you have questions, we'll try to answer them.
Thanks very much, Professor.